your webinar is on live on Zoom. They require link then.
Okay, sir. Sir, could you please
Yes,
promote?
we are sending you the link, okay?
Okay, sir. Sir, could you please promote Manvi Tyagi as the panelist as well?
Okay. So what I request.
Got it. Yes.
Okay.
Link
Sir, could you please promote?
We are sending you the link, okay?
Okay, sir. Sir, could you please promote Manvi Tyagi as the panelist as well?
Yes. Neha.
बस चैट बॉक्स में लिंक भेज दो पहले. एक मिनट. हाँ, मैसेज में को आ रहा है ना. ठीक है. Is not in this. Okay. Link कर दिया इसमें. पहले चलो.
I think Snehali, sir, we can start the webinar now, okay? Because so from our side we are okay. This webinar is on
sir.
YouTube live.
Okay,
let's
get tactic, Neha.
But Sneha again, I think
let's begin. और सुधाकर जी स्पीकर को छोड़ के बाकी सबको म्यूट कर दीजिए प्लीज.
Wait.
नहीं ललित वो मत करो क्योंकि वो अनम्यूट करने के लिए लाइक सुधाकर जी को प्रेजेंट रहना जरूर होगा.
नहीं रोहित, फिर ना आवाज आएगी बैकग्राउंड से. वी शुड
नहीं वो आवाज तो उनकी तरफ से ही आ रहा है. वो उधर वो स्ट्रीमिंग का आवाज आ रहा है. अदरवाइज वो all attendees are already muted. Only panelists have the only we 8 or 9 people can speak.
Okay, let's start then.
Yeah, let's start. I think we are already late.
Yes, sir.
And Sneha, if you want, you can take the streaming link from Sudhakar ji and you can share it with, share it on our, Facebook and WhatsApp groups. People
Okay,
can
sir.
join from there. You take the link from there and then, but I think let us start.
Yes, sir. Sorry, Nandana, could you please do that? Get the link and share it, please.
Sneha, I think you have the link for Zoom now.
Yes, sir.
Got it.
Thank you, sir.
Go ahead, dear. Go ahead.
Thank you, Sudhakar ji.
Most
Okay,
welcome.
sir. Shall we all begin, sir?
Yes, Jatin sir, are you there? Shall we start?
Yes, please do.
Yes, Sneha.
Okay, sir. Good evening, everyone. I, Sneha R., the President of ZEST, the Department of English, Deen, Upadhyaya College, University of Delhi, I'm honored to welcome you all to the discussion on 6 acres and a third by Fakir Mohan Senapati by Professor Jatindra Kumar Nayak. I would first like to welcome the speaker, Professor Jatindra Kumar Nayak, to this session today. So let me tell you a little bit about Professor Nayak. So Professor Jatindra Kumar Nayak is an eminent translator, columnist, literary critic and editor, and he studied at Ravenshaw College and the University of Oxford, and later taught at Utkal University, Odisha. Professor Nayak has translated Chandrashekhar Rath's Odia novel, Yantrarudha, into English as Astride the Wheel, for which he was awarded the Hutch-Crossword Book Award in 2004. He had won the Katha Translation Award in 1997. He has also translated Fakir Mohan Senapati's Mammo and J.P. Das's Deshkal Patra, into English. Professor Nayak is the co-translator of Senapati's Odia novel, Chamana Atskunta, into English as 6 acres and a third. Currently, he is a member of the English Advisory Board of Sahitya Academy. His upcoming work, Critical Discourse in Odia, which forms a part of the Critical Discourses in South Asia series, is to be published by Routledge by the end of this year. This is for the first time that the compilations of literary critical essays from different Indian languages will be made available in English translation. The Odia volume of the series, comprising 25 essays, has been edited by Professor Nayak and Animesh Mahapatra. We look forward to reading this important work, sir. Soon he'll edit a compilation of student-friendly critical essays on 6 acres and a third for Worldview. I would like to welcome you to this session, sir. Next, I would like to warmly welcome our teacher in charge, Dr. Rohit P, and all the faculty members. I would like to welcome all the attendees of this session. Last but not the least, I would like to welcome the ZEST team members to this session. I would just like to say before beginning the workshop that this session is being recorded and live streamed on the ZEST YouTube channel. Now, without any delay, I would like to invite Lalit sir to start the conversation on 6 acres and a third with Professor Nayak. Sir, please.
Thank you so much, Sneha. It is indeed a great privilege and pleasure to welcome Professor Jatindra Kumar Nayak, who I have always looked up to. I have learned a great deal from him and always look forward to listening to him. Welcome, sir. Sir, am I audible?
Yes, please
Yeah.
go ahead.
Sir, to begin with, could you please tell us about Fakir Mohan's life and times? I have come to know that Fakir Mohan's autobiography, Atma Jivan Charit, was one of the earliest books that you translated into English as the story of my life. So if you could also tell us what prompted you to translate this autobiography?
I must begin by thanking Deen, Dayal, Upadhyaya College and all your colleagues and students for giving me this great opportunity to talk about an author, a novelist and short story writer, a man of letters whom I admire so much. So thank you very much, all of you, for inviting me to take part in this exciting conversation on Fakir Mohan Senapati. Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
So let's begin by talking about Fakir Mohan's fascinating autobiography. Fakir Mohan was born in 1843 and died in 1918. So lived for about, say, 57 to nearly 75 years. As you can see, between the Sipahi Mutiny and the end of the First World War. And the record of the events unfolding in his constitutes one of the most exciting narratives in Indian literature. It's now available in three English translations. So it should be possible for students to take a look at. Fakir Mohan Senapati had a poverty-stricken childhood. He was an ailing child. He was an orphan, raised by his grandmother, and received very little formal education, I think up to class 3 or 4, learned a little Persian, and worked as a servant in a sail-making factory in Balasore. He was born in Balasore, which is a district in Odisha, bordering on Bengal. He worked there in the sail-making factory. During those days, Balasore was a very thriving center of trade. Sail-making industry was there, and then you had the salt manufacturing industry was also very prosperous. Ships sailed from Balasore to places like Maldives and Sri Lanka, and many other places. So it was quite a prosperous town, but soon its fortunes declined on account of many cultural policies. As you know, Odisha came to be colonized by the British in 1803. So within a few years of the colonization of Odisha, the fortunes of Balasore declined, and his own family also fell upon bad times. And Fakir Mohan took the job of a school teacher, taught for a few years in a school, and was largely self-taught, taught himself Sanskrit, taught himself English, and gradually, I think he came in contact with some British officials like John Deen, who was a great philologist, he was an Indologist, wrote a comparative grammar of Indian languages, Hindi, Odia, Bangla, and some other languages. So he needed help. He needed someone's help. So he found in Fakir Mohan a very good collaborator, learned a lot from him. And this led to Fakir Mohan becoming getting appointed as the Dewan of many feudatory states in Odisha. Odisha in those days comprised some 26 feudatory states or gorjats, and then areas directly ruled by the British. So before I talk about Fakir Mohan working in the feudatory states as a Dewan, Dewan is the second most powerful person in a feudatory state after the king. So it was, in fact, a very important position, powerful position. But before I talk about his experiences as a Dewan, which were quite exciting and fascinating, let me talk about another important dimension of his career as a school teacher in Balasore. Because around that time, I think Balasore was dominated by Odisha on the whole, as a whole, was dominated by Bengali bureaucracy. At the lower levels of bureaucracy, Bengalis dominated the state because in the state education had been spread. Odias couldn't occupy many important positions in the bureaucracy. So there was an attempt to replace Odia by Bangla in schools. So Fakir Mohan, along with a few other pioneers, few other energetic Odia leaders, tried to resist that attempt, and in the process introduced print culture into Balasore, set up a printing press, started bringing out a magazine, a newspaper. So early in his life, he was quite active as someone who promoted Odia language through print culture. So that was one very important aspect of his career before he joined a feudatory state as a Dewan. Actually, he worked in some quite 5 or 6 feudatory states as a Dewan, and his life in the feudatory states was quite eventful because he had to suppress quite a few tribal and peasant uprisings. So in the process, as you can see, he acquired a valuable experience of watching a whole society getting transformed under British rule, under colonial rule. In Balasore, which was a small town and was directly ruled by the British, participated in the language agitation there, tried to save his language from being replaced by another, more powerful language of a neighboring state. And then in the feudatory states, where he saw feudalism at work, he saw how British rule was transforming Odia society in different parts of the province. In those days, Odisha wasn't even a province, it was part of the Bengal presidency. Parts of Odisha were also part of Madras presidency and the central provinces. So Odia speaking tracts lay scattered in 3 different presidencies. In all these feudatory states, he also had to encounter, also to deal with tribal uprisings against the misrule of kings. And all these things, all these experiences are memorably recorded in this riveting autobiography, which was edited by his son because he serialized his autobiography. It was published in serial form in major literary magazine in the early decades of the 20th century. Then after his death, his son, a philosophy professor and a very famous essayist, he edited his autobiography and published it in 1927. So there is a lot of controversy about to what extent he was faithful to what his father wrote, whether he tampered with what his father wrote. And recently, the manuscript of Fakir Mohan's autobiography has been discovered. And if we are fortunate, a more authentic version of that autobiography will be available to the public. But National Book Trust has also published the English translation of a larger version of Fakir Mohan's autobiography. So after Fakir Mohan's career as a colonial civil servant came to an end, he faced financial crisis. He became a window and door manufacturer and sold these for a living, lived in Cuttack, which was the most important town from the point of view of colonial administration. And late in life, Earlier, he translated the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, wrote a lot of textbooks to preserve and promote Odia language when he was a school teacher, wrote the history of India. And then I think after he retired, he started taking a more serious interest in writing creative literature under pressure, exerted on him by one of the editors of one of the major literary periodicals. He started serializing Chamana Atagun, 6 seconds and a third in Utkal Sahitya. And it was such a sensational success that it said that people in villages would come to Cuttack riding bullock carts to watch the court case being tried in the Sessions Court. It was a fictional work, but the writing was so vivid that ordinary people thought they were reading a report on an actual crime. So Fakir Mohan's autobiography is an attempt to make sense of the way colonial rule transformed an agrarian society that was still rooted in a feudal order that had undergone or that has experienced Afghan rule, Mughal rule, then Maratha rule, then it was all these were replaced by British rule, and radical transformations took place in many spheres of Odisha's social and political and economic life. So Fakir Mohan was a brilliant witness to this process of transformation. But the writing of this autobiography is so good that some critics go to the extent of calling this his fifth novel, fifth work of fiction. So that's, in brief, a sketch of Fakir Mohan's career as a writer, as an individual who lived whose life spanned the period between the middle of 19th century to the end of the First World War. So roughly, this is how I would present his life as a writer.
Thank you so much, sir, for giving such an illuminating account of Senapati's life, his times, and his autobiography. You briefly talked about the novel, 6 Acres and a Third, Chamana Atguntha. It's a unique title. I was fascinated by the title, and so were my students. So how do you look at the title of the novel, 6 Acres and a Third, or Chamana Atguntha? How do you view it?
In fact, since we are children, we read it in our own mother tongue. We never thought the title was in any way unusual because we took it for granted that, well, this title is Chamana Atguntha. But when I translated it into English, I found the title to be resonant, found the title to be extremely unusual. I thought it was an extremely unusual title for a work of fiction. And I looked around for similar titles in Indian literature. And I could only find, and that's not a novel, Do Bigha Jamin, and that's a poem by Tagore. So I couldn't find any novel. Maybe your students may prove me wrong. In other languages, there might be novels which have a plot of land as the title. So this is quite unusual as a title of a novel, and that set me thinking. And this is not just a plot of land. For instance, one of the English translations of the novel is titled A Plot of Land, which I think does great injustice to Fakir Mohan's title. It's not just a plot of land. It is Chamana Atguntha, or 6 acres and a third. Not even a third, it's 8 decimals of land. I mean, an acre is divided in 25 units. So 6 acres and a third, roughly a third of an acre. So I realized that this is a precisely measured plot of land. When is land measured? A plot of land is precisely measured only when you want to sell it or purchase it. So land has become a commodity. So only when you want to sell or purchase a piece of land, when it becomes a commodity in the market, it's transformed into a commodity in the marketplace, you measure it precisely. So Fakir Mohan is not interested in land. Tolstoy has also written a memorable story, How Much Land a Man Needs. And there is also another famous novel, Odia, Matira Manisa, which has been translated into English, Born of the Soil, and published by Niyogi. It has been translated by a legendary translator, Professor Vikram Das, written by Karindi Panigrahi. But here, soil is a metaphor. There is a kind of poetic, lyricize land, presented as a kind of lyrical metaphor, man's relationship to earth. Fakir Mohan is not interested in that. You can see that it's an extremely unsentimental title. It's land as sellable commodity. So Fakir Mohan is talking about, this is the first major novel in Odia. Before that, he had 2 or 3 novels, and these were historical romances. 1881, you have Padmamali, as you can see, the novel is named after a heroine, who is a young woman from an aristocratic family. So like all romances, you have at the center of the romance a beautiful woman. And then another novel follows it, another historical romance, Vibhasini, set in the period of Maratha rule. So all these novels were named after heroines or heroes. But here, for the first time, you have a novel titled or named after a precisely measured plot of land, which means the land has become a commodity. Land is now available in the marketplace. So Fakir Mohan is actually talking about a kind of major social and economic transformation, which has completely changed our relationship to land. If you, this is not actually meant for experts, this lecture is actually meant for students. So if you just look at the etymology of the word colonialism or colony, actually it means, it derived from the word coller, which means till, tilling a piece of land. So colonialism is ultimately, at the end of the day, about land. Land being taken from one community by another. Land by occupied by people who are more powerful than you are. That is colonialism. So Fakir Mohan understands colonialism as a process of dispossession. People being dispossessed of their land through a particular legal system, a newly introduced legal system. I'll come to that later. I'll talk about utilitarianism and Fakir Mohan Senapati's 6 acres and a third as a critique, a trenchant critique of utilitarianism. So I'll come to that later. But Fakir Mohan in this novel is actually talking about the shifting relationship between man and land, human beings and land, men and women and land, under a colonial dispensation. And this relationship had changed. Earlier, I don't think human beings in Odisha, in other parts of India, under feudal rule, under Maratha rule, or under Mughal rule, owned land so that they could sell it. The land perhaps belonged to the king or the zamindar, and you could till it, you could enjoy its fruits, but it didn't belong to you as private property, a commodity which you could sell. So Fakir Mohan has intuitively grasped, or through his experience, grasped one of the major events that had taken place under colonial dispensation. So the entire novel is actually about man's changing relationship with land, and land itself changing its character, becoming a commodity. So that's how I look at the title, and many other things will come up in the course of discussion. I hope I answered your question.
Yes. Thank you so much for your comment on land and its commodification. In fact, while listening to you, I was reminded of Phanishranath Nath Renu's Maila Achal, which was written in the 1950s. And that novel in the Hindi heartland of India, especially in the context of Bihar, shows that how the history of post-independent Bihar, post-colonial Bihar, can be seen as the history of bloodshed, because land was reduced to a site of conflict. Unfortunately, even today, bloodshed happens in the name of land. But of course, as you pointed out, this is one of the earliest instances This is one of the earliest novels which captures on the relationship or the shifting relation between man and land. So I was reminded of Renu's novel, Mailamachal. Land has become soiled because of the bloodshed of constant conflict. And it was set in post-colonial India. To go back to Senapati, sir, can we look at 6 Acres and a Third or novel in general as a work of social realism or a work of art? How important is the narrative technique of this novel, the current novel, 6 Acres and a Third?
Whenever we look at modern Indian novels, particularly those written soon after or in the 19th century or somewhat later. By the way, Chomana Arthagun's 6 Acres and a Third came to be serialized in 1897 and was published in the form of a book in 1901 or 2, 1901, around that time. So it's one of the earliest novels focusing on, as you put it, the shifting relationship between human beings and land. Most early Indian novels in different languages of India, I've read a lot of Indian novels in India, other languages, but I think I can safely guess that most of these novels were about peasants, about the dispossession of peasants. Look at Godan, or you mentioned Paniswarnath Renu, but some novels in, for instance, Bengal, Bankim Chandra didn't write about land. He wrote something about will, and land is a referent in Bankim Chandra's fiction, but he wrote largely historical romances. There are novels like Krishnakant Will, so you have novels which deal with property and all that. But generally speaking, we think of early Indian novels as soon as the phase of romance was put behind us. Most of the early realistic novels actually dealt with disintegrating agrarian world and the dispossession of peasants, migration and all that. So Fakir Mohan Senapati didn't emerge from a vacuum. I told you that the 2 novels that were written, published before 6 Acres and a Third were romances, historical romances centered on heroines. But that was possibly, and there is strong evidence to substantiate what I say, he was influenced by an English novel. In 1874, in Bengal, Lal Bihari Dey wrote a novel in English titled Bengal Peasant Life or Govinda Samant. It had they had 2 titles, and it was written in English. It won a prize, a fabulous prize. 50 pounds sterlings in 1874 was a huge amount of money. So Bengali Jamindar announced this prize, and he joined the competition. And his novel, fairly large novel, I'm sure some of your students have gone through it, Bengal Peasant Life or Govinda Samant. Govinda Samant again is a poor peasant in a village in Bardhaman. And this is the story of his life from birth to death. Remember, another reason why I consider Chomana Arthagun to be unusual is that early realistic novels, as Ian Watt tells us, took the form of biographies. Most of these were disguised biographies. They presented themselves in Britain. Robinson Crusoe, Moll Flanders, Tom Jones, you take them, they all tried to present themselves as biographies. Okay, they presented themselves as fact. They didn't want to be presented as fiction. They were extremely self-conscious about it. So Lal Bihari Dey is following the tradition of British realistic fiction and presents the life of an individual from birth to traces the career of the hero from birth to death. And his life or his career unfolds in the backdrop of an Indian village. And the novel is written in English, just English. So, as I told you, Senapati was an autodidact, received very little formal education. So, he taught himself English. So, he has mentioned 4 books in his autobiography that these are the books I read after I taught myself English or learned English. My own. One is Arabian Nights, The other is the Bible. The third is Robinson Crusoe, very interesting, one of the foundational texts of realism. And he mentions Bengal peasant life, or in some editions of his autobiography, he mentions Govinda Samant. So, Chamana Arthagun of 6 acres and a third bear striking similarities with Bengal peasant life. Both are set in a village. Both focus upon the life of poor peasants who are being dispossessed by powerful zamindars or on account of tricks played by local bureaucrats. So, on the surface, you can see that this novel triggered, in a way, 6 acres and a third. But there are fundamental dissimilarities. And this will bring me to narrative technique. So at one level, they were talking about there is a reference. There is a reference point. The disintegrating rural agrarian world in British India, in colonial India, that's the referent in both the novels. Life of the peasants, the miserable life led by peasants who are illiterate and who fall victims to the machinations of powerful zamindars. Fine. So you have many similarities, striking similarities. But then you notice that Fakir Mohan is not a realist in the sense Lal Bihari Dey is. So what Fakir Mohan does, if you read Chamana Arthagun carefully, or 6 acres and a third carefully, or even if you read it cursorily, you quickly realize that it's a very different kind of novel. This is not the usual run-of-the-mill realist fiction which seeks to present the portrait of a world. Here, the most important character in this novel is the narrator. You have a very submissive and docile narrator in Bengal peasant life. Very allusive, talks about Dr. Johnson, talks about Hesiod, Virgil, when he talks about some poor peasant in a Bengali village. But he's a very submissive narrator. Very rarely, he's not playful. He's trying to describe a world and tries to remain as uncontroversial as possible, as inoffensive as possible, because this novel is written in English. Very likely an English official will read it and he may get punished. And he himself was a Christian. Lal Bihari Dey was a Reverend Lal Bihari Dey. He was a Christian convert. Have realistic novels written after this. But when you read 6 acres and a third, the very first page makes you aware that you are in the presence of something very, very different, something qualitatively different. He's telling a story. The story relates to the disintegrating agrarian world of rural Odisha in the 19th century. The period in which the novel is set is 1830s. So, 27 years after Odisha got colonized, the agrarian world is disintegrating. People are getting rendered destitute by colonial revenue policies. The economy has been monetized. People have to now pay revenue. And a moneylender class has emerged. People who lend money at high interest rates, and you mortgage your land, and when you can't repay the loan, your land goes to him. So an army of landless laborers emerged, and they were sent to Fiji, they were sent to West Indies, they went to Mauritius. You know these stories. But Fakir Mohan sets his action of the novel at a period when these tendencies were becoming manifest. But actually speaking, he's not interested in presenting a portrait of that world. So if you even read the first page, you come to realize that the most interesting character, the most lively, and what should I say, aggressive character in the novel is the narrator. So he creates a particular kind of narrator, a garrulous, playful, digressive narrator. And this narrator is performing a very important role for the first time, maybe in Indian fiction. I may be wrong, but one of the earliest attempts at really changing the relationship between the narrator and the reader. So think of the early novels. What was the job of the task of the narrator? He will tell a story, he would be an omniscient narrator, and the reader would be entertained. The reader is expected to read the story, see the action from his point of view of the narrator, and is supposed to enjoy the process of reading. A story has been narrated to. Incidents in the lives of interesting characters have been narrated, and he's supposed to derive a lot of aesthetic delight from that experience. Suspense is aroused and then it's fulfilled. So this is what the narrator was supposed to do. The relationship between the narrator and reader was defined in this particular way. But Fakir Mohan in Chamana, in 6 Acres and a Third, is trying to radically change the relationship between the reader and the narrator. As I told you, the narrator is playful, digressive, garrulous, and talks like a lawyer, a talkative lawyer. Most of the time, he's teasing the reader, he's challenging him, he's establishing a certain relationship with the reader. Friendly, ironic, sometimes he can also be brutal towards the reader. So for the first time, the reader is being defined. So who is the reader, implied reader of this novel? The implied reader of Chamana is an educated Odia, or in Bengali we call them Bhadralok. The educated Odias, and in all likelihood, it might be someone who might be English educated. So he is also constructing a readership and establishing a peculiar relationship with them, which can range from exchanging confidences, teasing him, sometimes openly insulting him. So the reader now begins to occupy a very important role, or is invited to play a very important role in the novel. So the relationship between the narrator and the reader has changed. And you can easily see, unlike Reverend Lal Bihari Dey, he is not telling a story like a good narrator. As far as storytelling element is concerned in the novel, Fakir Mohan can be portrayed as a bad storyteller. In fact, one of our greatest Odia critics, Notabar Samantraya, shows how Fakir Mohan is not a good storyteller. If you are asked to rewrite that story, you will write it in a much more suspenseful way. So maybe Fakir Mohan wasn't interested in telling a story in the conventional sense of the term. His interests lay elsewhere. That's why he adopted this very fascinating, very challenging narrative technique. So all along, you see, it's the narrator which is dominating the narrative. What is happening to the characters, you are not interested. You are interested in what the narrator, how the narrator is interpreting those actions, how the narrator is trying to manipulate your response. A couple of examples, and that might illustrate what I say. For instance, he's showing some village women taking a bath in a pond. So he says some very unpleasant things about them, presents them as extremely funny, recreates their idiomatic life. Then slowly you see he's moving away from that. He's no longer interested in the village women taking bath in the pond and quarreling among each other. There is although there is a wonderful description of that, but very quickly moves away and uses that pond as a metaphor for a colony. So he talked to the turned to the reader and said, look at the birds who are now catching fish here. So there are these trains which are plodding through the mud. These are Odias who are getting only a couple of little fish. There are water crows which fly from a long distance. They come and catch the best fish and they fly away. So the pond becomes, and look at the hawk which is sitting on the, or kingfisher which is sitting on a branch. Now it will swoop on fish and catch one and fly away. So the pond becomes or emerges or is transformed into a metaphor for a colony. And the poor cranes who are hopping in the mud, unable to catch fish, these are the poor Odias. He says, you must learn how to swim and go cross the seas and do what the British did to you. So as you can see, here is a subversive narrative. He's actually instigating people to turn against against a highly exploitative colonial dispensation. He said, these are people who are catching the best fish from your pond because they can fly. And at another point, we suddenly talk about science. That these have nothing to do with action. They have nothing to do with the, I'll summarize the story so that will make things easier for you later. It has nothing to do with the plot. He would say, look, science. You know, the British know science, therefore they're white complexion. You are dark-skinned Odias because you don't know science. So he's actually pulling your leg. He's making fun of many things. So all along, or at another point, he says that, well, you English educated Babus, Odia Babus, if I ask you your great grandfather's name, you won't be able to tell me. But if I ask you what's the grandfather of Victoria, who the great grandfather of Queen Victoria was, you will immediately tell me. And then he says something very, very interesting. He says, these days, suppose in old Sanskrit plays and Sanskrit kavyas, a beautiful woman was compared to an elephant, Gajagamini. Okay, so the English educated Odias would find it very inadequate, inappropriate. They want, because they have received English education, they would like their wives to run like horses. So these days, English educated Odias are buying whips with which they can, and saddles with which they can train their wives to run like horses. So all these are nothing to do with the action, nothing to do with the Jamindar taking away a plot of land. So very aggressive, digressive, and garrulous narrator is trying to create a new relationship with the reader. And why is he doing this? Why is he doing this? Because his interest doesn't lie in just telling a story. He's actually interested in dramatizing a series of civilizational displacements. If you look at the novel carefully, you will notice that at several levels in the novel, a number of displacements are taking place. Although the setting is a very small village and a very small town. Cuttack was actually a village, a large village. So you don't have the city, you have a very small village at the locus of the action. So what is his primary interest? His primary interest is to dramatize these displacements taking place at several levels. So what are the displacements? At one level, you see, if you look at the action of the novel, the unfolding action of the novel, a jamindari or an estate is passing from a traditional Hindu jamindar, whose name is Bagha Singh. And the language also changes. He's called a Bhumyadhikari. He's not called a jamindar. Jamindar is a Persian word. Bhumyadhikari, Bhumi Adhikari, is a Sanskrit word. So traditional landlord who was the custodian, in fact, he was the trustee of that estate. He got this in exchange for military services he rendered to the king. So there was an organic relationship between the landlord and the land and the people he ruled over. Then, during colonial rule, this passes into the hands of a Muslim horse trader. Someone sold very good horses to the British officials and they were very pleased with him, and the Jamindari passed into his hands through fraud. And from him, the Jamindari came to an Odia moneylender. He is not a Jamindar. He is a Jamindar, moneylender turned Jamindar. So he also got hold of the Jamindari through deceit. And finally, this Odia moneylender come Jamindar loses the Jamindari to someone called Ram Ram Lala. Whether he's an Odia or whether he's a Bihari, I don't know. An educated lawyer in Cuttack who promises to save him from the gallows because he is implicated in a murder case. So look at the displacement of the state. It moves from the traditional Odia Jamindar to a Muslim horse trader, Sheikh Dildar Mian, and then to an Odia moneylender turned Jamindar, finally to a non-Odia lawyer who is English educated. And with every displacement, the language changes. You have Sanskritized Odia when he talks about Bhagat Singh. The Jamindar, the traditional Jamindar, is described in highly Sanskritized Odia, elevated diction. And he's presented as someone who engaged in feasting and entertaining his people. Not a single beggar would go away from his house without being fed. So these rituals of mutuality, of charity. And then when you come to the Muslim horse trader who becomes the Jamindar, his son is a hedonist. He's always organizing parties, musical evenings, and palau and everything, and runs into debt. And then the moneylender, and there the language is Persianized. You find a lot of nearly 700 to 800 Persian words in the novel. I'll come to that later. So then the language is Persianized. And then you come to the Odia moneylender come Jamindar, who is a ruthless, acquisitive, economic man. So the language is colloquial, and he's the only literate person in the village. Except him and his gumasta, his agent, everyone in the village is illiterate. So at another level, we are also moving from orality towards literacy. An illiterate world is now being taken over by people who are literate, who are educated. So the transition from orality to literacy in Fakir Mohan is not always something to be celebrated. The literate are usually seen to be cheats, clever people. So finally it goes to an English-speaking or English-educated lawyer. So the displacement is taking not only at the level of land, it's also taking place at the level of language. And at one point in the novel, Fakir Mohan, the narrator, says, Sanskrit is a dead language. Yes. Odia is a half-dead language. Persian is gone. So English is the language that will replace all these. So you can see that he's not interested in a parcel of land or plot of land being taken away from a poor weaver by a local moneylender. That's not his focus of interest. He's trying to dramatize these very large scale displacements, shifts, civilizational shifts taking place. That's why the narrator is someone, again, who is extremely allusive. Throughout the novel, another narrative technique, a very important narrative technique he deploys is that of allusion. He's an extremely allusive narrator. Even when there is no reason or no need for bringing in an allusion, he'll bring it in. For instance, when the moneylender comes, when he talks about the miserliness of the moneylender come Jamindar, Odia moneylender come Jamindar, he refers to Benjamin Franklin. He refers to the Bible, that this man, that in the Bible, one bread could feed 1,200 people or 1,000. That this is this biblical legend, myth. So he's constantly alluding to different texts, to Kohinoor, to Clive, to Benjamin Franklin, just like the Bible, to Queen Victoria. So what do these allusions do? What is the function of these allusions? allusion as a narrative technique. One is that he's establishing a world beyond and above the world of action unfolding in the village. He's linking what is happening in this very small world to processes which are much, much larger and more momentous. For instance, when the moneylender comes, Jamindar defrauds the poor weaver couple of their parcel of land, he says that it is said it took Clive to take the Bengal Subedari, the Subah of Bengal, less time than it took to buy and sell a donkey. And then talks about this 6 acres and a third. So he's constantly linking colonial dispensation, the fraud underlying it, the deceit underlying it, to elements in the plot. So he's constantly trying to introduce these allusions so that links with a larger world, more momentous processes can be established. So here is, the characters are illiterate, most of them, but here is a highly literate narrator, and he's supposed to be addressing highly literate readers. And he's constantly challenging the readers to interpret actions, not just enjoy the unfolding of an interesting narrative. So the reader is given this dominant role in the narrative. So these are some of the narrative techniques that I can think of, that he assigns the reader a more active role, that he digresses deliberately. Sometimes he teases the reader, challenges him, insults him. Irony is a very important device because irony is used as a means of moral evaluation. And then allusions enable him to dramatize larger displacements taking place at the level of land, language, and power. So these are the things that I could immediately think of. Maybe in the course of discussion, other points I could raise.
Thank you so much, sir, for this detailed discussion on several aspects of his novel, especially the narrative technique. In fact, digressions, parody, irony, and allusions somehow often remind me of Swiftian narrator from Gulliver's Travels, or to some extent, the narrator from Tristram Shandy, though the analogy may not be correct because these two were writing in different contexts altogether. But these 2 points often remind, these 3 or 4 points like digression, parody, often remind me of these two narrators. So to go back to the question, next question, which was on emergence of Odia novel. I think, sir, you have partially answered that question. So if you won't like to add anything, then can we move to the next question, which is about 6 acres and a third being a critique of utilitarianism?
Okay, I think I have already touched upon the emergence of the novel in Odisha.
Yes.
That I have already talked about, historical romances and that. And
yes, sir, so we can escape that.
And then, okay, so now let me turn to 6 acres and a third as a critique of utilitarianism. Throughout the novel, you could notice that Fakir Mohan's narrator is engaged in a very strange kind of polemic. And this polemic is not directed against, let me begin again. There is always a tendency on the part of an uninitiated reader, an unwary reader, to read Samana Atagund as a moral tale, as a moral or morally charged narrative. This is how we read it as children. We thought that here is a bad man and he destroyed the lives of 2 very innocent people, or many other innocent people, and finally he came to a bad end. So this is how I think an uninitiated reader would, or unsophisticated reader would read Samana Atagund as a kind of moral tale or a narrative which tries to present poetic justice. As students of literature, we all know that poetic justice is expected of some narratives. But as you can see, this is not a novel about poetic justice. Too much is destroyed. Too many lives are destroyed. And this is one doesn't draw a very simple, neat, moral lesson from the narrative. So, as I told you, you have to go deeper. Fakir Mohan was something much greater was at stake. He was not bothered about drawing moral lessons from the fates of certain characters or certain incidents. I have already mentioned how he was interested in larger civilizational processes and displacements taking place at several levels: land, language, power, everything. So one can actually read this novel as a powerful, trenchant, multi-layered critique of utilitarianism. Why utilitarianism? Because in the 19th century, most of the colonial officials or people who came to colonize India were actually inspired by utilitarian doctrines. In fact, some of their mentors were great utilitarians like James Mill, who wrote a history of India. And utilitarianism tried to replace customs, conventions, traditions by something that is quantified, something that could be controlled by a rational bureaucracy. So all relationships, all customs, all social arrangements based on tradition, custom, and convention should be done away with. So Eric Stokes, actually, I would strongly recommend this book, Eric Stokes, English Utilitarians and India. For them, the primary unit of a society was a pleasure-seeking individual. Utilitarians didn't believe in community. They thought of society as comprising pleasure-seeking individuals who sought to avoid pain. They wanted to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. And they were engaged in competition with each other. And in a utilitarian scheme of things, everything should be quantified, or everything should be quantifiable. And laws should be based on not customs, not conventions, not traditions, but reason, written codes. So they came with this baggage to India, and this became a kind of laboratory. India was the laboratory for the utilitarian British colonial administrators. And they were interested in creating a huge market for British goods. So the traditional Indian society, its existing agrarian arrangements, customs, were inimical to the kind of world, or to the kind of policies which the British utilitarians sought to introduce. So they were out to destroy. Or that's why the first step that they took is making land a private property, a form of private property, making land sellable commodity, making it private property, taking it out of the ownership of community, or the forms of community ownership, was the first step they took. And that completely overhauled our existing social arrangements, that triggered processes that completely destroyed the agrarian world. And as I told you, that led to landlessness, but Fakir Mohan, that led to moral crisis, not just political, moral, economic, social crisis. And it led to the emergence of what I call the acquisitive or economic man. Those of you who have read Ian Watt's iconic essay on Robinson Crusoe, he talks of the emergence of the economic man. Robinson Crusoe finds himself in a deserted island. The first thing he does is to measure that land. He's not bothered about the trees, the beauty, the birds, and all. And he's constantly thinking of making a profit out of this island. So Ramachandra Mangaras, you can see in Fakir Mohan, is a new kind of man. All great writers create characters who embody invisible social and economic processes which ordinary people can't discern or understand. So In Ramachandra Mangaraj, you have a whole new outlook towards the world being embodied, vivid. I'll give you an example. So Ramachandra Mangaraj sells everything. Whatever is grown in his house is sold in the market. And Ramachandra Mangaraj wants to take possession of a cow, which belongs to this poor weaver couple. So somebody asks him, why do you want this cow? In fact, he is not to jail because he took away the plot of land from the poor weaver. He is sent to jail, he is convicted because he took away the cow. That was not in the list of goods which he had seized. So somebody asks him, one of his cronies, one of his darbars asks him, why are you so interested in this cow? He said, have you seen a paper mill? You put grass, you put bamboo, you put everything into the machine. At the end of the machine, the other end of the machine, you get white paper. Similarly, you give this cow grass, you give this cow fodder, and it will give you excellent white milk. And this cow was like a daughter to the weaver. They treated her like a daughter. So the relationship between man and land, man and the non-human world, everything has changed. Everything is now translated into a kind of commodity, a relationship, commodified relationship. So even in 1897, Fakir Mohan could visualize this isolated economic man who is unconnected with his wife, who has no relationship with his children, his family. You want land, money, more money. So this is a new kind of human being which utilitarian dispensation is generating, creating in the Indian context. So Fakir Mohan Senapati is actually trying to portray this world which is being disfigured by, in a way, completely destroyed by a new kind of utilitarian outlook on life where everything has a price. Everything can be bought and sold. And everything is seen from the point of view of an isolated individual. So in the novel, you can see the community disintegrate. All the bonds of community, the community bonds are loosened. So the disintegration of community is another central theme of the novel. And the rise of the acquisitive individual who grows at the expense of community. So there are in the novel so many digressions about how a community functions, what held a community together, what happens to human beings when they're cut off from the community, when the community disintegrates and gets atomized. So this is not just a novel about some people suffering because there is a bad moneylender ruining their life. This is about a whole new world coming into being under the pressure of a new utilitarian philosophy. That's why some people, at least I have done that, we compared it with Hard Times, which is the iconic novel on, or the iconic critique of utilitarianism. In Hard Times, what do you see? An education system which is obsessed with facts. The natural, national binary is dissolved. Everybody should do something that is useful. So, but in that novel, you don't have a very convincing portrait of a community. The Coke town that Dickens portrays doesn't have a vibrant community life anywhere. It's already destroyed. And the kind of community Dickens imagines is extremely inadequate and unconvincing circus. On the margin of that town, people who make a living by rearing horses. So there you don't find this kind of trenchant critique of colonialism, what colonialism actually does to human bonds, or community bonds. The terrible price one pays when a community disintegrates. So Samanarthakund is actually a moving commentary on the consequences, terrible human consequences of utilitarianism coming to dominate the economic, cultural, social landscape of an agrarian, which had thousands of years old history. So, Lalit?
Yes, sir. Thank you so much, sir. Sir, I'll cut down on some of the questions as time is running out. This is the last question that I'll ask you. Then we have some questions from the students. And if the time permits, quickly we can take some questions from the audience as well. Sir, this is going to be my last question. Now, many of the leading writers own their own publishing house, like Premchand, Maithili Sharan Gupta, Jatindra Kumar, Yashpal, and so on. Even in Europe, it was not a new phenomena. Balzac had his own printing press. I'm teaching one man
Hogarth press, yeah.
Virginia Woolf, yes, many of them own printing presses. Senapati too had started a printing press at Bhubaneswar as early as 1868, which, if I am right, was to be the third press in Odisha. How do you view this in the context of the relation between author and publisher? How enabling it was for Senapati as a writer?
I think that was Fakir Mohan set up a printing press in Bhubaneswar when he was a school teacher, because at that time he thought the threat to the very existence of Odia language had to be countered or combated. And then he was also in the business of writing a lot of textbooks. As I told you, he was always financially unstable. So the moment he got a job as a feudal administrator in a feudatory state, a new career began for him. And at the end of this career, he settled in Katha. Later, he also came back to Bhubaneswar before he died. And I don't think he set up a publishing house. But by that time, by 1897, many major Odia literary magazines were being published. Utkal Sahitya, later Mukura, later Satyavadi. So I think these editors, Fakir Mohan is already a very revered figure, cultural figure. As I told you, he's a cultural phenomenon. So people requested him to contribute. The editor of Utkal Sahitya compelled him to send him a serialized Chamana Artagund in his famous journal. So he didn't feel the need to. Already he was an iconic figure, started late in life as a writer. He began translating earlier. He was a textbook writer when he was a young man. But as a creative writer, he was already past 50, I think, when he started. You can see 1997, 40, yeah, he was already 54 when he started writing a novel. So by that time, he had already become an iconic figure. Every publisher wanted him to publish his novels or short stories. So that wasn't a big problem for him.
Okay, sir. Thank you so much, sir. Now, sir, may we take up some questions from my students?
Yes, that would be.
There are some questions that they have sent me. Meanwhile, among the attendees, if someone wants to ask something, you can send the question in the chat box, or if you want to speak, you can speak later after sir answers these questions. Sir, one student, Maitri, has asked a question. 6 acres and a third, I'm going to read out the question. 6 acres and a third is unlike any Western text we have ever read. It is like a storytelling session in an Indian family with lots of sarcasm and proverbs to prove a point. And hence the novel seems rather personal and relatable. How important do you think it is for Indian students to appreciate and enjoy various texts from their country with which they can easily relate, rather than struggling to navigate the unfamiliar scenes and setting of Western novels and stories?
Okay, I think that's a very good question. I think at some point in my presentation, I talked about the transition from orality to literacy.
Yes.
Fakir Mohan wrote at the point of intersection between orality and literacy, and orality really hasn't gone away. I think we still live in a predominantly oral world in India. So in Fakir Mohan's fiction, you find this vibrant orality constantly making its presence felt, even when he is engaged in writing. So even when he is engaged in writing about life or about processes of change, he's still very much a part of a vibrant oral world. So that's why you with this narrator. The narrator is actually someone who is a storyteller, as if he's narrating the story in the presence of. So the solitude that we associated with writing is not to be found in Fakir Mohan's fiction. It's constant. He's constantly negotiating the oral world, even when he's talking about the world of orality, even when he's writing a work of fiction. So, stories, proverbs, tall tales, the speaking voice, all these actually enrich Fakir Mohan's work of fiction. And I'm sure in some other Indian novelists you will also find this, because we are very much rooted in a vibrantly oral world.
Yes.
I'm completely bidden farewell to orality in India. So I think we must rediscover orality even in our written and printed texts.
In fact, sir, there are two questions on proverbs and their translation. I'll read out to you briefly. One is, Senapati used a lot of proverbs in the novel. Is that something intrinsic to Odia culture, which you have answered, sir? Or was it his style of writing? Also, was it difficult to translate these proverbs for them to make sense in English, or you simplified them for the readers? And another student has asked a question about O trees, sir, O-U-O trees. She said that she was puzzled when she came across this expression. And another student has asked a question about poetic justice, which you have answered, sir, while having a discussion on the novel. So would you like to talk about translation briefly, sir?
I think proverbs, riddles, all these are an integral part of an oral kind of vibrant oral culture. People constantly exchange proverbs, exchange riddles, exchange these sayings, invent them. So these attest to, or these indicate the liveliness of the oral tradition. And particularly in villages, in the rural areas, if you have grown up in a village, you can't live, you constantly come across them. They are a very rich part of one's life, and they illuminate one's experience, suddenly open up refreshingly new perspectives. They also can be great fun. About translating them, and I have already told you how orality expresses itself compulsively in Fakir Mohan's fiction. So it intrudes most of the time. Those voices you can hear, the carnivalesque, it lends his novels a kind of carnivalesque character. It's as if a community feast is going on. So that's the impression that only a few Indian novels can give, maybe some Western novels, but they're rooted in a tradition of literacy. I don't think this kind of very kind of thrivingly alive community life can be found in many novels which are rooted in a literate experience. About translation of proverbs presents problems everywhere. So as a translator, I can only say that sometimes you can translate them literally and they make sense. Sometimes they add a new dimension of meaning to English, because in English they may not have that proverb, but I think they will certainly find it very interesting and fascinating. So sometimes we translate them literally. Sometimes we desperately look for an equivalent. So sometimes we interpret them and paraphrase them. So a translator doesn't have one answer to a question. As the situation arises in the course of translating something, particularly when it contains all these sayings and riddles and proverbs, one has to take one at a time and find solutions which are specific to that problem. One doesn't have a kind of general one-size-fits-all answer.
Yes. Thank you so much.
O is a sour fruit. I'm sure it's seen in one comes across it in other parts of India. In Odisha, we call it O. It's a sour fruit. It's big. It grows in a big tree. So it's not tomato. It's widows eat it, cook it in the month of Kartik in Dal. So, and it has several layers. So if you give somebody a slap, he says that, well, it said that his cheek now looks like an O because it's swollen. So O is something, it's a big fruit, and its layers give the impression of something swollen. So if you slap somebody and his or her cheek is swollen, we say it looks like an O for a slice of O.
Okay.
Not tomato.
Okay. Okay.
I'm sure it's available in Delhi. So look for it.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, sir. Sir, we have Dhananjay Kapse, one of our colleagues from Kirorimal College. He has a question. Sneha, could you please unmute Dhananjay, sir?
Yes,
Can
sir.
we do it?
Yes, sir. I've
Please
just
do it.
unmuted him.
Dhananjay, are you there? Dhananjay,
Audible?
can you hear me?
Yeah, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible. Please. Go ahead.
Good to reconnect with you, Dhananjay. Do you remember we went together to Tiruvananthapuram?
Yes, yes, yes.
22
I am
years
so.
ago or 21 years ago.
I know. I'm so happy that you actually
Meet you
remember.
even what?
Thank you for remembering me, and thank you for this wonderful presentation on Fakir Mohan Senapati. As Lalit said, I'm his colleague, and I'm also teaching this novel. And I have actually a series of questions, so I can hold back if there are other students because they should always get first priority. Lalit?
Please go ahead, Dhananjay. If they have questions, they may ask towards the end. Please
Okay.
I may not be able to answer any question, so the students might get a chance. So
Okay. While I am quite willing to accept that there is a trenchant critique of colonialism and the rapacious acquisitiveness of someone like Mangaraj, I am not entirely convinced about how systematic and emancipatory that critique is. I'm not expecting a certain kind of activist socialist realism, but given the narrative trajectory of the novel and especially the last sections taken up with the death of Shantani and Ramachandra Mangaraj's beatific vision, combined with his nightmarish vision of Saria and Bagia, what seems to be rehabilitated, in fact, is the villain of the piece. Combine that with the very prominent passage towards the end of the novel where the villagers are saying, what does it matter if Lala Ramlal becomes the latest landlord? We are like the horse that is going to suffer irrespective of who the master is. And that also then brings me to a question about whether the pre-colonial, pre-1803 system in the rural countryside in Orissa was all that harmonious? Or is it a certain kind of romantic nostalgia for the past that seems to color the narrative voice? I'm deliberately not saying Fakir Mohan Senapati, the individual. So that's one question. The other was, again, interpretative protocols. You refer to Neta Cow and the paper mill analogy, which again is a striking passage. But how far is it reasonable to read it as the critique of greed and commodification within the discursive world of the novel? Because actually these are not words uttered by Ramchandra Mangaraj, at least in the different translations that I have referred to. Sadly, I don't have access to the Odia, but they are given to the reader by this omniscient, all-controlling satirical narrator. So, is it then the narrator who is guilty of establishing this likeness between Neta Cow and the paper mill? So I'll just begin with these two questions, and then I have some others.
I'll try my best to respond to these very searching questions. One is, I think all writers, no matter how prophetic they are limited by the circumstances in which they write. So one cannot transcend the limits imposed on him by his historical circumstances. But there is one important thing that in his autobiography he presents himself as someone who thought British rule was good and Maratha rule was bad, because there is this story of how they lost all their property because of Maratha misrule or whatever it is. And so he always presents in another novel that Maratha misrule was actually more dangerous and the British brought a lot of order. But in Chamanat, in his fiction, you find certainly you find an anti-colonial charge in the novel. So, like I gave you the example of the pond, where it openly talks about the bird coming across 7 seas and taking all the best fish away. So there are moments in the novel. You cannot have a consistent vision. And there is always this element of despair in the novel. You can see that at the end of the novel, the villager said that how does it matter? You have the portrait of a devitalized community. And that could itself be a kind of response to colonial rule. And pre-colonial rule is not romanticized, but at least the narrator has a vision of what a certain system that was at least more humane when he talks about the traditional Jamindar, Bagha Singh. He talks about a very, very humane dispensation. At the same time, as I told you, the narrator being very subversive cannot sustain any nostalgic vision for very long, because he also presents these traditional Jamindars, so the descendants of the traditional Jamindar family, as extremely violence prone, as superstition ridden, and can be very cruel to their own daughter-in-law. But at least when you look at the transition from one form of ownership of land to another, you can distinctly see that there is a progressive loss of humanity. So you can have, say, the charity and the whatever of the traditional Jamindars, then the hedonism, then this complete acquisitiveness, this kind of fanatic acquisitiveness, which leads to the disintegration of his own family, the murder of his concubine, the death of his daughter, wife. So you can see, if you look at the kind of destruction wrought by his actions, that exceeds in its intensity anything else that happens. But I'm sure this narrator is not someone who is nostalgic. There are other forms of power that he also interrogates, and all forms of power are not necessarily colonial. But I think the focus of the novel is on the kind of transition, the transformations brought about by colonial rule and its legal system and its land revenue system. So the focus is on this. And I think he's also governed by a number of aesthetic conventions, which allows him to give some compassion, to express some compassion, a modicum of compassion to someone who has suffered, someone who now regrets his actions. But that is never given as poetic justice. When Mangaraj dies and he sees all these horrible specters in his state of delirium, I think his actions are not being condoned. It's just a dying man is shown a modicum of pity. And all the villagers. So what perhaps he says is that a system or dispensation far harsher, more impersonal, more alien than even Ramachandra Mangaraj's Jamindari or rule as a Jamindar is on its way. So that's not necessarily just despair. This is a prophecy about the more painful realities awaiting the villagers. Because Ram Lala is an urban educated, English educated lawyer and has greater control and command of British laws, and he will be even more ruthless. So we can also interpret it like that. And as far as Neta is concerned, this cow, it's Ramachandra Mangaraj who compares her with the paper mill. It's reported by the narrator, but he compares her with the paper mill. So a new kind of outlook is striking roots in what is supposed to be a rural world, and which is untouched by technology, which is not exposed to technology, but already a certain mindset has begun to strike roots. I hope not a very satisfactory answer. I am not even.
No, there are no yes, no about these questions.
This is
I'm
how
also trying to think them through, especially about the terms of critical analysis that one uses. I mean, I was having this discussion with my students, and I just gave them this probably not very fruitful analogy, but given, I'll name names, right? So if one thinks of Adani and Ambani as the equivalents of Ramchandra Mangaraj in present day India, who just want to earn these millions of crores of rupees, and then on the other hand, you have millions of farmers being pushed into destitution. 100 years from now, if someone is reading a novel in which even the villain is given this kind of sympathetic death, and suffering multitudes are pushed under the carpet, what would be one's...
Partly because even a more dangerous villain is on his way. So that could be one way in which you could look at it.
Right.
And land continues to be a bone of contention. Land continues to be something that we are all obsessed with.
Right, right.
Okay.
Okay, so can you tell us some more details behind the recent controversy about the publication of this recovered autobiography? I was reading some reports about how there is a court injunction and his great-granddaughter has claimed that she is the owner of that manuscript, and Devi Prasanna Patnaik
I don't know very much about it, but I think there are some misunderstanding. I hope that will be cleared up, and this manuscript will get published and give us more information about Fakir Mohan's life.
Okay. No, since I don't have access to any version of the Odia, I'm very curious to know about the linguistic registers that he deploys in that autobiography, because I'm reading the Hindi translation.
Highly conversational. I think he writes like as he speaks.
No, but for example, does he use Balasore, the anglicized, or Baleshwar, the non-anglicized?
No, it's a wonderful combination of rural idiom, Persian elements, and Sanskritized Odia. So it's a fantastic blend of so many registers. So he can play with all these registers and create a wonderful, fascinating blend. So which works, which is extremely readable.
But which I guess will get lost in translation. Continuing with language issues, I am always struck by the Odia title of that famous story, Randipua Ananta.
Yes.
And I guess in modern Odia, one uses Vidhava.
Yes.
So again, moving away from the title, in the story, does he use the more or less taboo word Randi, or does he shift between multiple usages?
His mother is referred to very often in the novel, in this short story, but the title says Randipu Ananta. But in the story, she is presented just as a very, very strong woman.
Yeah, Singhani.
Right? As well as morally and emotionally very strong woman who can survive the of her son who died to save her whole village.
Right.
So I don't think the word Randi is used very often in the story. Maybe behind her back, people would call her son Randi Anta. They won't dare do that because she's such a strong woman.
Okay, one last question. Does one find evidence of these very extremely sophisticated narrative strategies in Shamanat Gund in his other three novels, Lachma and Mamu? I've just started reading your translation of Mamu, so I'll wait to discover that, and Prayashchit and the short stories.
No, I don't think you have. In no other novel, you find faint echoes of this narrative technique, but this is unique in the sense that the narrator has a field day here. In no other novel of Fakir Mohan, the narrator dominates the landscape as he does in, or he or she does in Chamanat. No, he loses that kind of lively liveliness, and you don't find that liveliness and subversiveness and so in other novels. But in some stories, you hear echoes of that. You hear echoes of that narrative voice. No.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Yeah. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Dhananjay. If we don't have any other question, we would stop here. Do you have any other question? One last question we may take, if we have something from the students or anyone else. If not, then we would like to stop. Thank you so much, sir. It was an enriching experience, as always, to listen to you. Thank you so much for giving this wonderful talk, which all of us thoroughly enjoyed. Sneha, are you there? Over to Sneha.
Yes, sir. So Manvi Tyagi will be presenting the vote of thanks. Manvi.
Good evening to all. I, Manvi Tyagi, Executive Member of ZEST, the Department of English, Dayal College, University of Delhi, deem it a great honor and pleasure to propose the vote of thanks today. We have learned a great deal and are very much indebted to our speaker, Professor Jatindra Kumar Nayak, who despite his busy schedule has found time for this session. I would like to thank our teacher in charge, Dr. Rohit P., and the faculty members for being a part of the workshop today. I would like to thank all the attendees of the session. Last but not the least, I would like to thank ZEST team members for all their efforts. Once again, thank you very much to all those who assembled here today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
So much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. We shall end the session here.
Just a sec.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Can we all have our videos
Yes,
on and
sir.
have a...
Yes, sir.
We can have a group photograph.
Yes, sir.
Sir, Jatin, sir.
Yes.
Are you there, sir? Can we have a group photograph, sir?
Yes, yes. I mean, I don't know how, but tell me.
Sneha, go
Yes,
ahead.
sir. The screenshots.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes.
Sneha.
Yeah.
Rohit, sir, you aren't visible.
Okay, is my video on?
Yes, sir, but it's completely blacked out. I think so.
Just a second. I don't know what.
So you were busy, sorry, you were visible in the beginning, but
How about now?
yes, sir. Now you're visible.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm going to take the screenshot. Okay, it's done.
And Professor Jatindra Nayak, thank you so much. I
Thank
couldn't welcome you in the beginning. I was traveling. It was really a wonderful session. I think you kind of touched upon all the aspects of the novel, and it was like like the entire novel kind of compressed into 1.5 hours. Thank you so much, sir. And we look forward to having you again with us once the college reopens.
Rohit is currently our teacher in charge, sir.
Okay, thank you, Rohitji, for your kind words. Hope to see you soon, virtually or otherwise.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
And thank you, Lalit.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. So